This is the moment. So having appointed the shipping company and got the container dispatched, the next task was to appoint an import or customs agent at the port of arrival, which in my case was Port Klang, which is the main port for Kuala Lumpur. Now it's important to understand the scope of responsibility of the various parties. The shipping company will bring the container into port and have it offloaded into a bonded customs area, and that's the point at which their scope finishes. You then need to have an agent to act on your behalf, to take responsibility for the container, to handle the customs formalities, to pay the port fees on your behalf, to attend the customs inspection, get the carnet signed, and get a release certificate from customs. And at that point they will arrange to have the container transported to a local depot where it can be opened and the container unloaded, or unstuffed as they seem to term it. Now I flew out to Kuala Lumpur and asked for recommendations, but the list I was given soon whittled down. Some companies just weren't interested in dealing with me. One company seemed to be very interested, very suitable, but when I got their price it was rather higher than the cost of shipping the container out from the UK. I finally honed in on a small to medium-sized company based in Port Klang called Airmark, and their price was reasonable and they seemed to be keen to do the business with me. But before the container arrived I had a change of plan. I had originally wanted to drive around Peninsular Malaysia before then shipping the vehicle over to Borneo. But there had been shipping delays, and when I reviewed the trip I realised I was going to be short of time, and so I decided to have the container redirected straight to Borneo to the port of Kuching. And it is possible to do this providing you make the arrangements before the container lands at the port of arrival. Now Airmark didn't have people on the ground in Kuching, and so they appointed another company to act as their local representatives. In fact, a rather larger company called Harbour Services Corporation, or HSC, and indeed very impressive. They got 4 or 5 depots in the region. They act as freight forwarders themselves, and they must handle hundreds of containers per year. But I didn't do my homework adequately, and there was one fatal flaw, and this came to bite me later on. I now want to digress a little bit and talk about the use of vehicle carnets, because these are very relevant to the story I have to tell. Now, as you probably know, the carnet is essentially the vehicle's passport, and the use of the carnet is governed by the International Convention on Temporary Admissions, which was signed in Istanbul back in 1980. And there are certain obligations on the signatories to this convention, of which Malaysia is one. And the basic obligation is that the receiving country shall respect carnets issued by other countries and shall allow temporary admission without undue delay or impediment. And there's also a provision in this convention which says that the involvement of government departments other than the Customs Department is to be frowned upon and deprecated, and if they are involved they must act with all due haste to speed up the importation process. Now, those of us involved in international vehicle travel, we all know about carnets, widely used, widely known about. But the trouble is that the people who most need to know, by which I mean the customs officers and the customs agents, are actually very often unfamiliar with their use. Right, so we come back to the story of this trip. I'll take it in 2 parts. I'll firstly try and recount the events as quickly as I can, and then I'll give you my take on things. So my container eventually arrived in Kuching, and my agent there then went to see customs without my presence. They had an alarming tendency to do this, even though I had said I want to be present at all meetings with customs. It later emerged that the agents had never dealt with a carnet before, they didn't know what they were doing, and they were completely unsuited to act as my representatives on this. Furthermore, the Kuching customs officers weren't familiar with carnets, and their initial reaction was that it wouldn't be accepted, and that the only way I could bring a vehicle into the country temporarily was to register under the Malaysia is my second home, or MM2H program. Now this is a program which is aimed at attracting wealthy retirees to come into the country, bringing a lot of money with them. Clearly inappropriate for tourists like myself, and incidentally taking months and months for the procedure to be approved. If you are registered under MM2H, you can bring a vehicle in for a period of up to 6 months. Well, my agents accepted this at face value. They took away the application form for MM2H, and they told me that this was the only way I was going to get the vehicle into the country. Well, I went absolutely apeshit. They didn't know what they were talking about. I challenged the ruling by Kuching Customs, who then phoned head office in Kuala Lumpur, and they were advised that yes, Malaysia did accept the carnet, but under one proviso, and that was that you also got an approved permit, or AP, from the Ministry of Trade and Industry, or MITI. Now this is a fairly straightforward thing to get, but it takes over 2 weeks to arrive, even with a lot of expediting. So my agent in KL applied for the permit. I flew back there to have various meetings, do a lot of expediting, flew back to Kuching, a lot of waiting around, a lot of frustration, and more than 2 weeks later the AP finally arrived. Everything seemed set fair. Kuching Customs said that things could go ahead. We immediately had the customs inspection of the vehicle and its contents. But there was one final hitch, and again my agent in Kuching met customs unaccompanied by me, and Kuching Customs said that they would be unable to stamp the carnet because it hadn't been stamped in the UK first. And again my agent took it at face value. As far as they were concerned, the vehicle would have to be re-exported to the UK. Well, when I was told about this, I was able to sort it out immediately. And there's a very simple explanation. The UK government does not recognise and does not use the carnet, and they do not routinely stamp carnets, and they will only do so by special request. And so I went to see Kuching Customs, explained this to them. I was able to give the name of the UK customs officer and his phone number, and when it was explained to them, there was no problem, and they stamped it immediately, and they finally released the container. What joy. It was transported to the HSE yard, where it was finally opened up, and at last I was able to get my vehicle back. This is the moment. Well, we now have the rainforest living up to its name. Well, this was a fairly damaging episode to me and to the trip, and so what was my take on events? Well, firstly, I would maintain that since Malaysia is a signatory to the Carnet Convention, they ought really to take the carnet at face value and allow vehicles in without delay, as apparently they always have done in the past. And apparently this requirement for the MITI permit was only introduced at the back end of last year. Now, under the Carnet Convention, they are allowed to have requirements like this, although they are disapproved of. But a point I would make, this new requirement appears to have been very badly communicated. So neither, for example, the carnet issuer in the UK, nor indeed either of my customs agents, nor indeed the main shipping company, CMA CGM, whose customer representative I met in Kuala Lumpur, none of these parties was aware of the requirement for the MITI permit. Now there does seem to be general inexperience in the use of carnets, and indeed when I questioned my two import agents after the event, they both sheepishly admitted that they hadn't processed carnets, and certainly not in the recent past. And if I was going to do it again, I would probe much harder up front and before appointing customs agent. Now the inexperience in using carnets indeed extends to many customs officers, and you can go to a border post, present the carnet, and find the guy doesn't really know what to do with it. Now on the inside back page of the carnet there are directions for use, and I would strongly advise the user to read these directions and familiarise himself with them. And so if you have a customs officer who doesn't quite know what to do, you can politely and tactfully point out how he needs to process it, which bits he needs to stamp and sign, and which voucher to tear off, and so forth. And if you do this, I think you'll find that things are going to go a great deal more smoothly.